The August heat was relentless as Marta descended, for the last time, the stone steps of the modest house she had shared with her late husband. It was the year 1862, and the yellow dust of the road swirled with every gust of wind, clinging to the sweat-soaked skin of her 6 children. The eldest, Diego, just turned 11, held firmly the hand of the youngest, a girl barely 3 years old who walked with unsteady steps, while Marta carried the 4-month-old baby in her arms. Her brother-in-law, a man with a hard gaze and an even harder heart, had barely waited long enough for his brother's body to cool in the earth. "This house needs working hands, Marta, not mouths to feed," he had said with a coldness that cut deeper than any knife. The words echoed in Marta's ears like the sound of a death sentence. 7 months had passed since tuberculosis had taken her husband, leaving her alone with 6 small lives dependent solely on her. Her belongings, the few they possessed, lay scattered on the dusty path: a dented copper pot, 3 blankets worn from use and years of washing, and the clothes they wore, already stained with sweat and despair. There were no pleas or tears, for Marta had learned long ago that crying was a luxury she could not afford, a waste of the scarce moisture her body needed to continue. She looked one last time at the adobe house with its red-tiled roof that was now forbidden to her. Her brother-in-law had placed a new lock on the door, his figure silhouetted against the brutal afternoon light, watching them leave as one watches sick animals being led away from the healthy herd. Marta clenched her jaw until her teeth ached, the bitter taste of contempt and powerlessness filling her mouth. She said nothing. She simply took the trembling hand of another of her children, feeling the small fingers cling to hers with a mixture of fear and trust, and turned her back on everything they had known. The silence of her children weighed more than the scorching August sun. It was a learned silence, that of those who know that complaints do not change fate, only the ability to endure it. With the baby tied firmly to her back with a tattered, faded shawl, and the other 5 following her in an orderly line like spectral little soldiers, Marta began to walk towards the mountains. They had no clear destination, only a direction. Away from the accusing glances, away from the compassion that was worse than disdain, away from the civilization that had spat them out. Hunger was a constant presence, an animal gnawing at her insides without rest, but terror was even worse. The terror of the approaching night, of the wolves howling in the distance, of the cold of the mountains that could sicken the youngest and lead them to the same place where their father rested. Diego, trying to fill the void left by the man who was no longer there, walked with a stiffness unbefitting his 11 years, his brown eyes constantly scanning the horizon for threats his childish mind could barely comprehend. Marta knew with absolute certainty that they would not survive long in the open. The air was beginning to grow heavy, and dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, threatening a storm that their ragged blankets could never repel. It was then that her memory rescued the story, that place everyone spoke of in fearful whispers, the iron scar rusting in the middle of the mountains. It was a 2-day walk if one had the necessary strength. The locals called it the Flying Coffin, a transport airplane that had crashed more than 25 years ago, a steel monster that, they said, had brought with it its own curse. No one dared to approach it, not even the most needy or adventurous. The men of the village lowered their voices when they mentioned it, making the sign of the cross and spitting 3 times on the ground to ward off the evil eye. They said the metal had poisoned the water of the nearby streams, that the spirits of the dead airmen still moaned during new moon nights, and that something more primal, older than the mountains themselves, had claimed the shattered fuselage as its territory. Marta felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the wind that was beginning to rise. The central legend, the one that chilled the blood of even the bravest men and made mothers keep their children indoors after nightfall, was that of the giant serpent. This was no common viper, but a colossal creature, a boa constrictor as massive and ancient as the very mountains that had witnessed its birth. It was rumored that its body was as thick as an adult bull's torso, and when it shed its skin, which happened near the spring, the remnants it left behind were longer than 3 men standing one upon the shoulders of the other. The elders said it had chosen the remains of the plain as its lair, perhaps attracted by the cold metal that retained temperature during hot nights, or perhaps protecting something the mountain had entrusted to its custody. Martha had dismissed these stories as fanciful tales meant to keep children close to home, but now, with the sky turning an ominous gray and her youngest daughter's suppressed cry, those stories took on a terrifying weight. The dilemma she faced was as brutal as it was simple. Face the storm in the open, where the cold and mountain rain would undoubtedly sicken the little ones to death, or seek refuge in the metal coffin that everyone swore harbored a monster capable of swallowing them whole. Martha watched the black clouds advancing like a relentless army from the west, and then turned her gaze to the green, silent mountains rising before them. The fear of the serpent was an ancestral, deep terror rooted in the most primitive part of her being. But the fear of seeing another of her children tremble with fever, of watching their lips turn blue from hypothermia, was a present and immediate terror, a dagger constantly pressing her throat. The boa constrictor was an uncertain possibility. The storm was a certain sentence. Marta squeezed Diego's sweaty hand tightly. "We need to walk faster, son. I know a place where we can shelter from the rain." They reached the foot of the mountains just as the first raindrops, enormous and heavy like liquid stones, began to hit the dry ground, raising that pungent, unmistakable scent of wet earth mixed with ozone. The ascent was a true physical and mental nightmare. The path was practically non-existent, hidden beneath a tangle of thorny undergrowth that tore at their already ragged clothes and scratched their exposed skin. Marta carried the 3-year-old girl in one arm, which burned from the effort, and the baby in the other, while Diego and the others pushed and helped each other from behind, forming a human chain of survival. The metal of the airplane was completely invisible from the mountainside, swallowed by 25 years of wild, relentless mountain vegetation growth. The air was dense, heavy with humidity, and the silence around them was different from that of the valleys. It was not an empty, reassuring silence, but one full of invisible presences, of life that watched, crawled, and waited patiently in the shadows. The children were completely exhausted, their small chests heaving from the tremendous physical exertion and the fear that consumed them from within. Finally, James, who had taken the lead with the desperate bravery of a boy trying to be a man, stopped abruptly. "Mom, it's there," he said in a choked voice. Martha looked up, her trembling hand pushing aside a thick vine that hung like a vegetable curtain. What she saw was simultaneously worse and more impressive than anything she had imagined in her worst nightmares. It wasn't merely a crashed plane. It was the gigantic skeleton of a metallic leviathan, dead and abandoned by time. The aluminum fuselage, stained by decades of relentless rust and covered by a thick tapestry of dark green moss, was split into 3 distinct sections. The tail pointed towards the cloudy sky at an impossible, unnatural angle, like an accusatory finger pointing at the gods. Vines covered it completely, as if they were the arteries and veins of a living creature, and the twisted roots of ancient trees had grown through the shattered windows, reclaiming the metal as part of the forest. It was undoubtedly a tomb, there was no doubt, but a metal tomb that promised a solid roof over their heads. The rain lashed down furiously, rapidly transforming into a violent deluge that soaked them to the bone. Martha urgently pushed the children towards the dark, menacing opening of the shattered pilot's cockpit. Right at the main entrance, where the twisted, rusted metal formed a dark arch resembling the mouth of a prehistoric animal, they found the first unmistakable sign. James saw it first and let out a choked cry of pure terror that made everyone freeze. It was a shed snakeskin, but not just any skin, occasionally found in the wild. It was a shed skin as thick as Martha's thigh, completely dry, brittle, and translucent in some parts, laid out ceremonially like a macabre welcome mat that partially blocked the passage inside. The geometric patterns of dark diamonds were still perfectly visible on the dead skin, a silent but terrifying testament to the absolutely colossal size of its owner. The children instinctively recoiled, some openly beginning to cry from fear, but a deafening, violent thunder rumbled directly over their heads, and the rain suddenly turned into hail the size of quail eggs. The storm was more immediate, more tangible than the abstract terror of the beast that might lurk within. "Inside, right now," Martha ordered in a trembling but firm voice, making it clear there was no room for debate. She gently but determinedly pushed her children over the dry, crunchy skin into the absolute darkness of the fuselage. They huddled together inside the abandoned plane, on the slanted, cold metal floor that smelled intensely of accumulated dampness, centuries-old rust, and something harder to identify. A stale, penetrating odor that combined stagnant river with animal death, an aroma that permeated every molecule of breathable air. The children clung to each other, forming a human cluster, trembling simultaneously from the penetrating cold and primitive terror. Martha desperately tried to light a small fire with the damp tinder she had saved in her pocket, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking uncontrollably, making the task impossible. Outside, the storm hammered the aluminum roof as if 1,000 giant drums were being played simultaneously by furious hands. And then, precisely amidst the deafening roar of the storm, they heard the first slide, a sound that somehow managed to silence even the clamor of the storm in their minds. It was the sound of an immense, almost inconceivable weight, a rhythmic, deliberate, and terribly heavy dragging across the metal roof directly above their terrified heads. Martha embraced her children with all the strength left in her exhausted body, silently praying to every saint she knew, knowing with absolute certainty that the legend was not merely a story to frighten children. They were sharing their refuge, their only protection against the elements, with the giant mountain serpent. Before continuing with this story that will move you to tears, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any incredible stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you had to choose between facing a deadly storm or sharing refuge with a legendary creature? Your answer interests me greatly, so leave it below and let's create a community where we share our experiences and thoughts. Now, let's continue with what Martha discovered in that abandoned plane. The first full morning inside the rusted fuselage was considerably worse than the endless night of terror that had preceded it. The storm had finally passed after hours of unleashed fury, leaving behind a dense, damp, sticky silence that grotesquely amplified every small sound they made. The hunger, which for days had been a dull, constant murmur in their stomachs, was now a sharp, desperate cry that gnawed at the insides of each of Martha's children. The metal of the abandoned plane sweated condensation from all its surfaces, and the penetrating cold clung stubbornly to their soaked clothes as if it had a life of its own. Martha felt a pang of regret so sharp and painful that it literally cut off her breath for several terrifying seconds. What on earth had she done? She had traded hunger under a relatively safe roof for hunger in a rusted metal tomb, shared with a colossal beast that could devour them one by one during the nights, starting with the smallest and most defenseless. The stale, penetrating odor, that nauseating mix of stagnant river and decomposing animal death, was significantly stronger with the grayish light of dawn, constantly reminding her that they were not alone in that cursed place, that their desperate refuge was simultaneously the nest and hunting ground of a primordial predator. The children looked at her with huge, bright, expectant eyes, patiently waiting for her, their mother, the only adult they could trust, to have some kind of master plan, unaware that she too was completely terrified and only had fear and hunger. The following days transformed into a silent torture of minute-by-minute survival. Martha imposed the strictest rules, speaking in a barely audible voice, a harsh, controlled whisper, in the oppressive stillness of the plain. Never run, never shout under any circumstances. Always move slowly and silently, she ordered them repeatedly each morning. Every children's game had to be completely silent, every movement carefully calculated to make no noise. The shattered fuselage was simultaneously their protective armor against the elements and their claustrophobic cage. The children quickly learned to walk on the slanted, slippery metal without their dirty, bare feet producing any echo, to communicate exclusively through elaborate gestures and meaningful glances. Martha taught them with infinite patience to never, under any circumstances, stray from the direct sight of the shattered pilot's cockpit, to deeply fear and respect the invisible line of shadow where the metallic refuge ended and the wild, unpredictable jungle began. The children, with that astonishing capacity for adaptation that only the youngest possess, obeyed without questioning. Their visceral fear of the legendary serpent far surpassed their natural need, and the childish exuberance of playing, running, and shouting. They gradually became silent, little ghosts, moving cautiously in the perpetual gloom of the abandoned plain, while the outside world vibrated and hummed with an exuberant life that was entirely forbidden to them by danger. Hunger was such a constant and familiar presence that it had practically become an additional member of the family, ever present in every thought. Martha meticulously explored every dusty, rusty corner of the wrecked plane, searching for anything, whatever the dead pilots might have left behind. But 25 relentless years of wild vegetation, scavenging animals, and decomposition had left absolutely nothing usable. Not a dented can, not a moldy crumb, not a drop of stored drinking water. Growing desperation led her to chew unknown leaves she tore from nearby vines, spitting them out immediately due to the bitter, toxic, nauseating taste they produced. The younger children, especially the 3-year-old girl, cried at night with weak, piteous, heartbreaking sobs that Martha tried to silence by offering her completely empty breast, as her breast milk had dried up entirely due to mental anguish and a total lack of nutritious food. The characteristic scent of snake, that musky, earthy, primordial aroma, permanently permeated their ragged clothes, their tangled hair, their very skin, as if the invisible beast were deliberately marking them with its essence, territorially claiming them as part of its domain. On the morning of the 4th day of their agonizing stay, Martha finally saw it clearly. She was crouched precariously near one of the broken, jagged windows of the fuselage, carefully trying to collect residual rainwater in the dented copper pot when a fluid, massive movement in the nearby stream completely captured her attention. She held her breath until her lungs burned. It wasn't simply a fleeting glint or an optical illusion produced by hunger. It was a solid, real, and terrifying mass. An absolutely colossal body, covered in dark, shimmering geometric patterns that reflected the morning light, glided with lazy yet lethal grace towards the crystal-clear water. The snake was significantly thicker than Martha's own torso, longer than anything her mind could have imagined, even in her worst childhood nightmares. She watched it, fascinated and terrified, as it submerged its massive triangular head in the water, drinking from the stream with an absolutely terrifying calm, completely indifferent to the small, hungry human family watching it, petrified from their rusty metal nest. The giant boa constrictor seemed to ignore them completely, evidently more interested in the fat capybaras and abundant fish than in the malnourished, hungry humans who would barely make an unsatisfactory mouthful. But that apparent indifference offered Martha no comforting relief. On the contrary, it was a brutal and constant reminder of her complete insignificance in the natural order of things, a crushing weight of failure that settled heavily on her slumped shoulders. She had led her precious children directly from social destitution to a slow death in the very heart of primordial danger. Her ruthless brother-in-law had thrown them out to slowly starve on some dusty road, and she, in her desperation, had led them directly to potentially be devoured by a legendary beast. What kind of mother was she, really? Each time she directed her tired gaze towards the emaciated, pale face of James, who bravely tried to maintain an appearance of masculine strength, or towards the deeply sunken cheeks of the baby, who barely had the strength to cry, she felt she was failing them in the same cruel and relentless way the whole world had failed her when she needed it most. They had successfully escaped the calculated, conscious cruelty of humans, only to fall directly into the clutches of nature's primordial, ancient, and relentless indifference. Hunger was absolutely constant, an inseparable companion, but the fear she felt was considerably worse, more corrosive to her soul. A fear that not only stemmed from the physical presence of the giant snake surrounding them, but from her own devastating and growing inability to protect her children from absolutely anything. And then, precisely on the 5th night of their living nightmare, the screams returned with renewed intensity. The storm had completely abated days ago, and the mountain air was strangely still, almost breathless, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath expectantly. Martha was half asleep, simultaneously cradling 3 of the younger children to provide them with some body heat, when the sound violently jolted her awake, making her heart pound. It wasn't the sound of the wind howling among the rocks. It definitely wasn't her restless children. It was a sharp, whining lament, almost mechanical in its regularity, yet undeniably organic in its essence. A disturbing sound that insidiously filtered through the rusted metal, cutting like a knife through the oppressive silence of the sleeping mountains. The sound clearly came from outside the fuselage, but it was unsettlingly close to their position, a sound that no animal she knew or had ever heard in her life could produce. It superficially resembled a desperate human cry, but it was definitely not human at all, nor did it seem to belong to this known and rational world. The older children also heard it clearly and instinctively pressed against her, their small bodies trembling violently with a completely new and different terror. Martha felt her blood literally turn to ice in her veins, but the initial paralysis of fear was gradually replaced by a strange, furious, and desperate curiosity growing within her. That disturbing sound was definitely not the characteristic sound of the giant snake. With trembling hands, she grabbed the only available object that could remotely function as a defensive weapon, a heavy, rusted metal bar, part of the landing gear that had detached during the violent impact of the crash. The colossal beast lifted its massive triangular head very slowly, the fluid movement almost hypnotic to observe. Its eyes, completely lidless, dark as bottomless pits and strangely reflective under the sparse moonlight, fixed directly on Martha with an intensity that pierced her. The animal produced a low, prolonged hiss, a sound similar to an ancient bellows slowly being compressed. But surprisingly, it did not attack. It did not aggressively uncoil from its position. It merely watched with terrifying stillness, as if jealously guarding that specific piece of rusted metal and earth. Martha remained completely motionless, barely daring to breathe shallowly, her immediate fate hanging precariously on the thin thread of the serpent's unpredictable patience. And then, from the hidden depths beneath the massive, scaly body of the watchful serpent, from the mechanical entrails of the engine it so jealously protected, the mysterious wail sounded again with renewed clarity. It was sharp, plaintive, strangely mechanical in its repetition. The giant serpent seemed to ignore it completely, keeping its attention fixed and unshakable on the daring human who had ventured so close to its protected territory. James, who had disobediently followed her in absolute silence despite her explicit orders, suddenly appeared by her side and nervously tugged at her torn shirt. "Mom, what on earth is that sound?" he whispered, his voice utterly broken by visceral terror and complete disbelief. The wail continued to sound repeatedly as if something were desperately trapped deep within the metal, something suffering terribly and crying for help. The colossal serpent was undoubtedly the designated guardian of that mysterious and disturbing sound. Martha very slowly lowered the rusted metal bar, dropping her defensive stance as well, and looked alternately at the motionless serpent, then at the buried engine, and finally at the starry sky that stretched infinitely above them. She wasn't sure if it was extreme desperation speaking through her hungry mind, or if it was an incipient madness naturally springing from prolonged hunger and constant fear, but she suddenly felt an absolute and inexplicable certainty invade her completely. These mechanical, disturbing cries posed no direct threat to her family. They were a call, a mysterious invitation, a call that, for some reason impossible to comprehend rationally, she specifically had to answer personally. The giant serpent was not her cruel jailer, nor her appointed executioner. It was the ancestral guardian of a profound secret, a secret it had faithfully protected for decades. And Martha, brutally expelled and rejected by civilized men, now found herself face to face with a primordial beast that jealously guarded the only answer, the only hope she had left in the entire known world. Paralyzing terror gradually gave way to a silent obsession that consumed her every thought. Martha spent the next 3 full days completely captive to her own tormented mind. Her body remained physically curled in the shattered cockpit of the plane, but her gaze was constantly fixed, almost unblinking, through the broken and rusted metal, obsessively focused on the left engine and its colossal, motionless guardian. She had ceased to be a simple, desperate widow fleeing hunger and social rejection. She had completely transformed into an obsessive sentinel, a desperate decipherer of ancient mysteries she did not understand. The boa constrictor, utterly motionless for endless hours, its scaly skin a complex map of shifting shadows and filtered light through the foliage, seemed like a living mountain of dormant muscle and contained power. But its lidless eyes, always wide open, perpetually vigilant, watched constantly. Martha instinctively felt deep within her being that they were not watching the surrounding jungle for prey or threats, but specifically guarding the metal buried beneath its massive body. The devastating hunger of her children was a dull but constant cry in her tired ears, a brutal and constant reminder that available time was rapidly running out, that each passing hour brought them closer to terminal starvation. But that other mysterious and disturbing wail, the one constantly emanating from the buried engine, had inexplicably become an existential question she absolutely needed to answer to justify having risked her children's lives in such a desperate manner. On the suffocating afternoon of the third day of her obsessive vigil, the mountain wind dramatically changed direction. It stopped blowing from the south, laden with the sticky, dense humidity of the nearby stream, and began to arrive directly from the north, a considerably drier and colder wind that rushed down from the highest peaks of the snow-capped mountains. With that change in wind, the mysterious cries returned with completely renewed intensity. They were significantly stronger now, sharper and more penetrating, a plaintive and desperate note that impossibly sustained itself in the mountain air, causing the terrified children to instinctively cover their ears with their dirty hands. Martha felt a deep shiver of sudden revelation run down her spine. The disturbing sound was not at all constant or continuous. It was not a living, conscious creature crying voluntarily according to its will or whim. It depended completely, exclusively on the wind. She observed with renewed and almost scientific attention how the mountain breeze rhythmically moved the dense vines covering the buried engine, and how the lament dramatically rose and fell in intensity in perfect correlation with the gusts of wind. It was not at all a living, conscious being that suffered. It was something completely inanimate that the wind made sound mechanically. It was a ghostly flute accidentally created by fate, a macabre whistle of chance and destruction. Her entire perspective on the giant boa constrictor changed radically and completely at that precise instant of understanding. It was no longer simply an opportunistic monster that had conveniently chosen a warm, protected nest to establish its territory. It was exactly what she had instinctively felt that terrifying night, a guardian designated by forces she did not understand. The colossal beast was not positioned on that specific engine by mere chance or convenience. Its deliberate presence on that particular and concrete engine, precisely the one that produced those unsettling cries with the north wind, was a convergence absolutely impossible to explain by simple coincidence. The serpent was not protecting its personal nest from the intrusion of Martha and her hungry family. It was jealously guarding the very origin of the mysterious sound from the curious and potentially dangerous outside world. Its apparent indifference to the desperate, hungry family living a few meters away was neither disdain nor lack of predatory interest. It was absolute concentration on a more important task. It had an ancestral and profound purpose, a sacred vigil that had probably lasted years or even decades, and that purpose was physically buried beneath its muscular, impenetrable coils. Martha suddenly understood with crystal clarity that she had to wait patiently, not flee cowardly while they still had some strength. The forced wait gradually transformed into an almost unbearable physical and mental torture. Constant hunger relentlessly gnawed at her contracted insides, and growing weakness caused her vision to blur dangerously at the edges, producing floating dark spots. James, visibly pale and alarmingly thin, with his ribs clearly marking beneath his stretched skin, had completely stopped asking when they would eat something substantial again. He only stared fixedly at her with sunken, dark eyes, patiently waiting for some sign, some indication of what they should do. Martha obsessively watched the motionless snake, waiting with almost superhuman patience. She knew instinctively that no matter how mythical, legendary, and seemingly supernatural the beast appeared in the villager stories, at the end of the day, it was simply an animal of flesh and blood, and absolutely all animals have basic, inescapable needs that must be satisfied to survive. The scorching August sun relentlessly beat down on the aluminum fuselage during the central hours of the day, systematically turning the inside of the plane into a true suffocating and unbearable oven. The heat was absolutely stifling and oppressive, making the air itself seem to visibly vibrate, but paradoxically, it brought with it renewed hope for Martha. Relentless thirst. The boa constrictor, like absolutely any living being that breathes and has circulating blood, would inevitably need to drink fresh water. The crystal-clear, cool stream was located less than 60 meters away from the engine. Martha prayed fervently, not to the distant god of churches who had abandoned her, but directly to the snake's biological and inevitable thirst. And then, precisely at the highest and most suffocating point of the afternoon's oppressive heat, when the sun was exactly at its zenith and the air seemed to burn, exactly what she had been waiting for with such desperation finally happened. The massive, muscular coils began to move perceptibly, a lazy but deliberate uncoiling that seemed to last an agonizing eternity. Pure muscle visibly contracted beneath the shiny, scaly skin. The skin reflected the sunlight with an oily, iridescent sheen. The colossal head, as large as a cast-iron pot, majestically lifted and sampled the surrounding air with its forked tongue that flickered in and out rhythmically. Then, with a liquid and terrifying grace, like a dark, massive river completely reversing its natural course, the snake's colossal body began to glide smoothly, finally abandoning the buried engine. It moved with deliberate, terrifying slowness, its tremendous weight audibly crunching the dry undergrowth and fallen branches. Martha literally did not breathe for the next 30 endless seconds. She watched hypnotized as the snake gradually disappeared into the dense, lush vegetation, clearly and directly heading towards the refreshing stream. The rusted engine was finally exposed and vulnerable, silent and seemingly harmless, completely covered in bright green moss and compacted earth. It was their unique opportunity, possibly the only one she would ever have. "James," her voice came out as a dry, harsh croak she barely recognized as her own. "Guard your siblings with your life. Don't let them move an inch, no matter what they hear or think they hear." She clearly saw pure, unfiltered terror in her eldest son's sunken eyes, but she also saw mature understanding and determination. James nodded solemnly, his small jaw clenching with a determination that shouldn't exist in an 11-year-old boy. Martha firmly gripped the heavy, rusted metal pipe, no longer as a defensive weapon against the legendary beast, but as a desperate lever against the cruel fate that had brought them here. She cautiously stepped out of the protective fuselage, her bare, cut feet immediately sinking into the warm, sticky mud. The exact 20 meters that physically separated her from the buried engine seemed to stretch infinitely, like an impossible battlefield to cross. The mountain air was so dense and laden with humidity that she could almost physically chew it. The unnatural silence of the surrounding jungle was absolutely deafening in its intensity. every solitary hum of an invisible insect immediately transformed in her mind into an alarm of imminent danger. The mountain air was so dense and laden with humidity that she could almost physically chew it. The unnatural silence of the surrounding jungle was absolutely deafening in its intensity. Every solitary hum of an invisible insect immediately transformed in her mind into an alarm of imminent danger. With every trembling step, she constantly expected to suddenly feel the massive, cold body of the snake unexpectedly returning, coiling around her body, squeezing the air from her lungs. She finally reached the buried engine, panting. Up close and without the intimidating presence of the snake, it was clearly a rusted tomb of forgotten human engineering. It was approximately half buried in the soft, damp earth. Dense, ancient vines desperately clung to it as if actively trying to drag it into the depths of the all-consuming earth. The snake's characteristic scent was absolutely overwhelming and almost made her vomit, an intense stench combining stagnant swamp and concentrated animal musk that violently churned her empty stomach. The mechanical screams, now considerably softer without the strong north wind blowing, persistently remained there, a low, constant, and deeply plaintive hiss that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the metal. She frantically and with growing desperation searched for the exact source of the disturbing sound. It wasn't a clean, defined hole as she had imagined. It was an irregular, jagged crack. A thick sheet of metal from the engine's outer fuselage had violently bent outwards from the tremendous impact of the accident, creating a jagged and dangerous opening, a deep, rusted wound in the industrial steel. She cautiously brought her ear to the opening, feeling the surprisingly cold metal pressing against her sweaty, dirty skin. The mysterious sound definitely came from the interior depths of the engine, the mountain air vibrating and resonating through the broken metal and internal cavities. She finally found the exact specific crack, a narrow, deep, and completely dark slot that delved into the mechanical entrails. The wind, even the slightest, most imperceptible breeze, was efficiently trapped there by the accidental geometry of the destruction, violently forced to pass over a terribly sharp metal edge, mechanically creating that plaintive, ghostly note that had terrified generations of locals. It was the wind. All this endless time, all this paralyzing terror, and all these sleepless nights. And it was only the wind being trapped and manipulated by a broken piece of rusted metal. The relief she felt was as devastating and overwhelming as the profound disappointment that accompanied it. She felt incredibly, painfully stupid and naive. She had deliberately risked the precious lives of her 6 hungry and sick children. She had seen mystical signs and divine messages in a simple mechanical whistle produced by chance. She had desperately searched for a saving miracle and had found only a current of air passing through shattered metal. A dry, harsh, almost hysterical laugh, more like a tearing sob, burst uncontrollably from her parched throat. There was absolutely no deep secret hidden, no mystical call or message from beyond, just a brutally broken plain and a snake keeping its ancestral vigil. She leaned heavily against the cold, rusted engine, pressing her sweaty forehead against the icy metal, feeling the crushing and absolute weight of her complete failure as a mother and protector. They were completely alone in this hostile and indifferent world. No help was coming, neither human, nor spectral, nor divine. Devastating hunger returned with a violent, renewed force that almost brought her to her knees. She wept in absolute silence, producing no tears because her dehydrated body had no moisture left to waste, only the uncontrollable trembling of her exhausted frame betraying her desperation. Out of pure impotent rage and accumulated frustration, she violently thrust her right hand into the dark crevice, as if to physically strangle the mocking sound, as if to tear out the cursed piece of metal that had cruelly mocked her and her desperate hope. Her fingers painfully scraped the terribly sharp edges of the metal. The sharp pain violently pulled her back to immediate reality. There was absolutely nothing of value inside, just an empty, dark hollow and the mocking echo of the mountain wind. But as she carefully pulled out her scratched and profusely bleeding hand, her broken fingernails accidentally grazed something entirely different, something that was definitely neither cold metal nor compacted earth. It was located deep within the dark cavity, deliberately wedged in, completely out of casual sight. It wasn't hard or metallic. It was fabric, thick, tough fabric, strangely stiff and with a waxy texture to the repeated touch. Industrially waxed canvas specifically designed to relentlessly resist the passage of time and destructive moisture. It was definitely not an original part of the plane or its components. It had been placed there deliberately by human hands with a specific purpose. With her heart beating so violently and furiously that her chest and ribs literally ached, Martha plunged both trembling hands deep into the absolute darkness and pulled with absolutely all her remaining strength. It was a considerably heavy and solid bundle, deliberately wedged with tremendous force between the dead and rusted internal mechanisms of the shattered engine. The waxed fabric was completely stiff from decades of exposure, and her bloody fingers repeatedly slipped on the waxy, slick surface. She pulled desperately with the superhuman strength that only absolute despair can provide, clearly feeling the terribly sharp edges of the crevice bite deep into the delicate skin of her forearms, leaving bleeding cuts. The mysterious package would not budge an inch. It was as if the jungle itself, or the very spirit of the shattered plane, stubbornly refused to release its decades-guarded secret. She suddenly heard an unmistakable, clear splash in the nearby stream. It was the giant snake. It was inevitably returning to its watchpost. Absolute panic gave her a completely supernatural strength she didn't know she possessed. She desperately clung to the waxed canvas with both bleeding hands, planted her bare feet firmly in the slippery mud, and pulled violently backward with absolutely the entire weight of her malnourished body. The mysterious bundle finally moved with a crunch, scraping loudly against the internal metal with a sharp, squealing sound, and then suddenly shot out, falling heavily at her feet with a dull thud that echoed. It was a rectangular metal box approximately the size of 2 large bricks placed together, tightly and completely wrapped in industrial waxed canvas and tied multiple times with greenish copper wire. She didn't think for another second. She grabbed the heavy box, feeling its unexpected and completely surprising weight, and ran. She ran desperately the full 20 meters back to the protective fuselage, repeatedly stumbling over exposed roots and stones, her heart a deafening alarm bell violently ringing in her chest. She literally hurled herself inside the shattered cockpit, urgently pushing the terrified children toward the darkest, most protected rear, and huddled, trembling, in the relative darkness, violently panting with the mysterious box clutched tightly against her chest as if it were the world's most valuable treasure. The boa constrictor had not yet returned to its position, or at least had not actively followed her during her desperate run. The absolute silence that immediately followed her frantic dash was total and oppressive, broken only by her own agitated, desperate breathing and the muffled, weak cry of the hungry baby. Matthew stared at her with wide eyes. His eyes were two dark, unfathomable wells filled with urgent, unanswered questions. Martha carefully placed the mysterious box on the sloping metal floor. The copper wire was completely green from decades of oxidation and corrosion, but surprisingly still strong and resistant. She used the terribly sharp edge of a stone she had specifically kept for scraping edible roots, and after long minutes of sustained effort, which seemed to stretch into endless hours of agony, the wire finally gave way with a snap. The waxed canvas peeled away like an old brittle husk, finally revealing the metal box it had been jealously protecting. It was significantly rusted on all exposed edges, but the main central seal seemed miraculously intact after so many years. It had no visible lock or obvious opening mechanism. It was hermetically soldered or sealed with some kind of extremely durable industrial resin. Growing frustration made her tremble uncontrollably. She held the long-sought secret literally in her bloody hands, but could not open it in any way. Matthew, intently observing her desperate struggle, silently handed her the rusted metal tube she had dropped earlier. "Use this, Mom," he said in a surprisingly calm voice. Martha nodded gratefully, her throat too dry and constricted to utter a word. She carefully placed the sharp edge of the tube into the visible seam of the box and repeatedly struck the other end with the heavy stone. 1, 2, 3 consecutive times. The metallic sound resonated violently in the hollow fuselage like a pistol shot, a dangerously loud noise that could attract absolutely anything perilous. But Martha no longer cared at all. She struck again and again with accumulated rage, with desperate hunger, with absolute despair. The seal finally broke with a satisfying crunch. She carefully pried with the tube, and the lid finally opened with a prolonged groan of tortured metal that hadn't been moved in decades. Martha reached her trembling hand inside, expecting what exactly? Glistening gold? Precious jewels? Cash? She carefully pulled out the mysterious contents. It was not a treasure that glittered spectacularly under the light. It was something considerably heavier, denser, and potentially more valuable. A thick book of dark leather, its cover swollen and significantly warped by decades of penetrating moisture, but miraculously still intact and legible. And beneath the book, a yellowed paper, carefully folded several times over itself, as stiff as the leather itself from the passage of time. A rudimentary map, meticulously drawn with what appeared to be charcoal or faded black ink over the years. The intense smell of accumulated mold and hermetically sealed time immediately wafted from the open box. A ghostly sigh of 25 years of isolation. The children approached cautiously, their small, gaunt, pale faces lit by childish curiosity and lingering fear. Martha carefully opened the ancient diary with hands that trembled violently. The yellowed pages were stuck together by accumulated dampness, their corners darkened, stained, and brittle like dry autumn leaves. The black ink had run and blurred in many parts, making some passages completely illegible, but the overall handwriting, though clearly desperate and shaky in many sections, was still surprisingly clear and legible. It undoubtedly belonged to one of the pilots of the crashed plane. His full name was Frederick Reed. He had miraculously survived the initial crash. He wrote in detail on the first pages Martha managed to read. The airplane broke into multiple sections. The jungle immediately devoured it. I am completely alone, with a brutally broken left leg, the white bone exposed to the air. I constantly heard my 2 companions die agonizingly in the first days after the accident, their desperate screams horribly mingling with the sounds of the jungle. Then only silence remained, absolute silence and unbearable constant pain. He wrote extensively about the devastating hunger, about the thirst that drove him mad, about the madness that approached inexorably with each passing twilight. Weeks of agony passed. Frederick described in chilling detail how the relentless jungle systematically reclaimed the plain, how climbing vines grew visibly each day, progressively covering the broken windows and blocking out the light. His shattered leg had become severely infected. He knew with absolute certainty that he was going to die slowly and painfully there, completely alone. He wrote extensively about the constant sounds, specifically about the wind persistently blowing through the broken engine, a sound he initially thought was the ancestral spirit of the mountain crying specifically for him. "It is my personal funeral song," he wrote in shaky script. "A constant, relentless lament that reminds me hour after hour that the end is near and inevitable." Martha felt a deep shiver run down her spine as she read it carefully. The ghostly cries that had obsessively guided her here were literally the pilot's self-prophesied funeral. Then the narrative changed dramatically in tone. A new entry with a later date. The handwriting considerably shakier and more irregular. "I'm not completely alone after all. At first, I firmly thought it was a high fever playing with my mind, producing hallucinations, but then I saw her clearly and repeatedly. A young boa constrictor, apparently drawn by my complete stillness, by the persistent smell of my infected wound. She was relatively small by jungle standards, perhaps 4 meters long. She approached me daily without any apparent fear, with the natural curiosity of a creature that had never known systematic human cruelty." Frederick, in a desperate act of absolute loneliness and need for companionship, began to generously share his scarce emergency rations he had managed to recover from the wreckage. He threw her small pieces of jerky, biscuits soaked in rainwater. The snake ate gratefully and faithfully returned each following day. "She is my only companion in this green hell," Frederick wrote in a particularly emotional later entry. "I have appropriately named her Guardian, for she seems to jealously watch over my future grave, as if it were a sacred treasure." The dying pilot had found unexpected and deep solace in the snake's constant presence. She regularly coiled near him, her cold, scaly body absorbing the residual heat from the metal under the sun, and he spoke to her extensively, confessing all his deepest fears, his accumulated regrets, his frustrated dreams. The snake, now consistently well fed by his carefully shared rations, grew visibly week after week and had remained permanently there in the specific engine, the exact spot where her first and only human friend had generously fed her, the place where he had finally died alone. The boa constrictor Martha feared so much, the giant that now completely dominated the creek and terrorized the locals, was exactly the same snake. She had spent 25 full years faithfully guarding the final resting place of her human benefactor. The last entries of the diary were almost completely illegible, the smeared ink mixing with what appeared to be dried bloodstains. "She is the designated guardian of my last secret in this world." Frederick knew with certainty that others would eventually come, perhaps opportunistic scavengers, perhaps treasure hunters. He wrote specifically about this metal box, about how he had carefully hidden it in the screaming throat of the engine, fully trusting that the constant sound of the wind and the intimidating presence of his guardian would effectively deter the curious for decades. The ancient map, he meticulously explained, marked a hidden cavern behind a nearby waterfall, less than half a day's careful journey following the creek. There he had hidden what truly mattered for survival, what he had desperately tried to save from the violent accident. Martha unfolded the map with trembling, incredibly careful hands. The drawing was surprisingly simple yet clear. The shattered plain, the winding creek, a series of distinctive tall stones, and a simple cross marking a specific point behind a drawn veil of falling water. Martha reverently closed the ancient diary, feeling the weight of history in her hands. The wailing of the engine was no longer a terrifying ghostly cry, nor a mystical message from the afterlife. It was Frederick's persistent voice, the melancholic echo of a completely solitary man, guiding her directly toward her family's survival. The boa constrictor, far from being a monster stalking her with malevolent intentions, was the faithful guardian of an ancient promise, the last act of unwavering loyalty from a creature towards the human who had shown her kindness when she needed it most. Martha looked intently at her 6 children, their gaunt faces now lit by a fragile but real hope. The pilot had written the absolute truth on his last legible page. It's not an instant fortune that shines. It's something considerably better for the long term. It's a possible future. The complete revelation of the diary radically transformed the heavy air inside the fuselage. The paralyzing fear that had held them captive for endless days suddenly evaporated, replaced by an entirely different energy, a hope as sharp and potentially dangerous as the hunger that constantly gnawed at them from within. Martha carefully studied the rudimentary map, the faded ink a silent testament to a dying man's unwavering faith in a future he would never see. Then she looked at her children for a long time, their faces visibly pale, their eyes deeply sunken in their sockets, their bodies alarmingly weakened by prolonged starvation. The baby's cry was now barely a weak and intermittent whimper, almost imperceptible, a terrifying sign that his small body was giving up. She knew with absolute certainty that they didn't have much time left. The guardian was still at the stream drinking. It was their only possible window of opportunity, the brief interlude that Frederick, without consciously knowing it, had bought her 25 years ago through his kindness to a solitary creature. James, her voice was barely a harsh whisper, but charged with a new authority that surprised even her. We are getting out of this plane. The pilot left something specifically for people like us. Getting out of the plane was like being reborn into a completely hostile and indifferent world. They took their first hesitant steps out of the protective metal, no longer as terrified prey constantly hiding, but as seekers with a clear purpose. The jungle air, once oppressive and full of invisible threats everywhere, now felt simply dense and humid, just another physical obstacle to overcome with determination. Martha carefully counted her children as they gradually emerged into the dappled light filtering through the canopy. 6. She carried the baby tied tightly to her back with the shawl and firmly held the hand of the youngest girl. James went ahead bravely, his thin shoulders straight, assuming a bravery and leadership he clearly didn't feel but needed to project. They superficially resembled emaciated survivors of a terrible shipwreck, a fragile line of humanity against the overwhelming and indifferent green of the mountains, blindly following the map of a man dead a quarter-century ago. Following Frederick's map was a true test of absolute faith in the unknown. The drawing was deceptively simple. Follow the winding stream north, but the mountainous jungle was an absolute chaos of treacherous roots spreading like snakes and thick mud that sucked at their bare feet with every painful step. Martha constantly kept one watchful eye on the path ahead and the other on the bank of the crystal-clear stream, her heart leaping violently with every submerged log that superficially resembled a dark, scaly back, with every shadow that moved among the dense vegetation. The visceral fear of the boa constrictor had not completely disappeared from her mind. It had simply been temporarily overcome by the desperate and urgent need to reach the waterfall marked on the map before their strength completely abandoned them. The mountainous air was heavy with the constant buzzing of insects and the pungent smell of wet earth and slowly rotting vegetation, a complex fragrance of decomposition and new life occurring simultaneously. The younger children stumbled repeatedly, their stick-thin legs visibly trembling from extreme weakness. Martha felt panic rising like bitter bile in her parched throat. This was taking too much precious time. The guardian was fundamentally an animal with needs, and its thirst wouldn't last forever. It would inevitably return to the engine, to its ancestral watchpost. And what if they got lost in the thicket? And what if the map was simply the feverish delusion of a dying, delirious man? The entire jungle seemed like a green labyrinth specifically designed to confuse and disorient. Constant hunger made the world swim slightly before her eyes, producing dark spots in her peripheral vision. She had to focus her mind. She had to believe firmly in something. She was literally betting the lives of her 6 precious children on the written words of an unknown ghost. "Mom, there they are." James's voice was a broken whisper from extreme physical exertion. Martha looked up tiredly, pushing aside a dense curtain of hanging vines with her free hand, and there they were, exactly, just as Frederick had meticulously drawn them on the map. 3 enormous, tall stones, massive rock formations, completely covered in bright, wet green moss, rising majestically like gigantic blunt teeth directly from the earth. They looked exactly like the representation on the map, line by line. A torrent of relief so powerful and overwhelming that it almost literally brought her to her knees in the mud, completely flooded her. Frederick had been physically here, in this exact spot. The map was completely real and verifiable. It wasn't madness or a desperate fantasy. Hope suddenly ceased to be a fragile and tangible fantasy and became something absolutely solid beneath her tired feet. Beyond the 3 distinctive stones, the sound of the stream dramatically changed character. The soft, soothing murmur was gradually drowned out by a dull, constant, powerful roar. The air felt noticeably colder, laden with a fine, refreshing mist that floated. They painstakingly pushed their way through the last giant ferns that looked like small trees and stopped abruptly all at once. The waterfall wasn't an immense, spectacular cataract like those in heroic legends, but it was a constant, powerful, and beautiful veil of crystal-clear water that fell approximately 5 meters into a bubbling, deep pool. The fine mist immediately clung to their hot, sweaty skin, providing momentary but blessed relief from the heat. Frederick's map was absolutely clear at this point. The X marking the promised treasure was directly behind that roaring curtain of water. Martha stared fixedly at the roaring wall of water. It was noisy, visually violent, and the dark space behind it was a deep, completely unknown shadow. She immediately thought of snakes. Boa constrictors love fresh water and humid places. What if this was the true main nest? What if the guardian had an extended family? Fear instantly returned, cold and completely paralyzing. But then she vividly remembered the diary. The snake's demonstrated loyalty was specifically tied to the plane's engine, to the place of its first significant encounter with a kind human. This place was exclusively Frederick's, his personal secret. She carefully handed the baby to James, whose thin arms could barely hold the small weight. "Stay exactly here. Watch over your siblings with your life. Don't let anyone move an inch. If I don't come back in—" She hesitated painfully, not wanting to complete that thought. "Go back to the plane. Do you understand perfectly?" James firmly shook his head, his eyes instantly flooding with pure terror. "No, Mom, we're all going with you. We won't leave you alone." Martha instinctively knew she couldn't leave them alone in the jungle, nor could she force them to go back alone. All right, come all together, but in absolute silence. Take the hand of the sibling next to you. Don't let go under any circumstances. I'll go first to test the way. She breathed deeply, filling her lungs with humid air, and took the first decisive step toward the roaring water. The impact was absolutely brutal, a deafening cold that instantly stole the breath from her lungs. The constant roar left her completely deaf. For an absolutely terrifying instant, she was completely blind, overwhelmed by the tremendous power of the water, feeling the slippery, moss-covered rock beneath her unsteady feet. But she kept advancing blindly, trusting her instinct. One trembling step, 2 more steps, and then the deafening roar was suddenly behind her. She was in the silent gloom. The cave was completely real and not a product of her imagination. It wasn't a deep cave that had ventured miles into the mountain, but a dry, sheltered refuge naturally carved behind the constant veil of water. The air was completely still and smelled intensely of ancient dust, of completely dry earth, definitely not the characteristic scent of death and musk from the snake. She turned carefully and gently pulled Matthew through the curtain. One by one, with infinite patience, she helped all her children cross the water curtain, their small bodies trembling violently from penetrating cold and persistent fear, until all 6 were huddled together, panting in the protective darkness of the cave. The filtered light from the waterfall subtly seeped in, creating a watery, ghostly glow on the rock walls. Martha cautiously moved deeper, her eyes gradually adjusting to the gloom. And then she finally saw it clearly. Stacked neatly in the driest corner of the cavern, meticulously protected from destructive humidity, was Frederick's true, tangible legacy. 4 large wooden boxes hermetically sealed with industrial wax, and next to them, carefully arranged, a complete set of perfectly preserved tools covered in a thick layer of protective grease, a woodcutter's axe with a wooden handle, a long sharp machete, 3 shovels of different sizes, and picks for digging. These were tools for survival, not glittering treasures. With hands trembling in anticipation, she used the machete to carefully open the smallest box. Inside, there was no gold or precious jewels. There were thick cloth bags filled with perfectly preserved dried seeds and dozens of hermetically sealed dark glass jars. "Quinine," Martha whispered with a broken voice, immediately recognizing the name of the medicine that could potentially have saved her husband from tuberculosis. As Frederick had precisely written, it was not an instant glittering fortune. It was something immeasurably better. It was a complete future. The tears Martha shed in that dark, sheltered cave were not of sadness or despair, but of a relief so profound and overwhelming that it physically ached in her chest. They were tears of deep gratitude for a man dead 25 long years, a complete stranger who, in his final agony, had generously left them the fundamental tools for life and survival. The quinine was not simply a bitter powder in glass jars. It was an effective armor against the tuberculosis that constantly plagued those mountainous lands, the same disease that had cruelly taken her husband. The seeds were not simply worthless dry grains. They were complete future gardens. They were nutritious corn, protein-rich beans, and fruit trees that could feed her children for years. The axe and the machete were not simply cold, inert steel. They were the concrete ability to cut firewood for warmth, to build a shelter considerably more dignified than the plain, to effectively defend against threats. It was the complete inheritance of human survival. For the first time in 6 endless and agonizing months, Martha no longer saw the next day as just another obstacle to overcome, but as a real possibility, as a tangible future. Immediate hunger, however, was a physical reality that the seeds could not instantly solve. The baby's faint cry abruptly pulled her from her grateful stupor. She quickly opened the second box with eager hands. Frederick had literally thought of everything with astonishing foresight. These were the emergency rations he had specifically mentioned in his journal, the ones he had deliberately not shared with the Guardian. Hermetically sealed boxes of rock-hard but nutritious military biscuits, cans of preserved meat, and dark chocolate bars, brittle from the 25 years that had passed, but miraculously intact and edible. It was real food, not much in total quantity, but absolutely enough to give them renewed strength, enough to build the critical bridge between starvation and the first future harvest. She broke a hard biscuit with hands trembling with emotion and gave it directly to James. "Eat very slowly," her voice, choked with emotion, commanded, "and share equally with your siblings." Watching them chew slowly, seeing life gradually return to their sunken eyes, was a more powerful and satisfying feeling than any treasure of gold or jewels. The return to the plane was tense, but completely different in spirit. They were no longer desperate fugitives fleeing, they were settlers with a purpose. Martha carried a small box with the immediate rations and the precious quinine, and James held the machete firmly, not as a weapon of war, but as the fundamental tool it represented, feeling the weight of the steel and the responsibility it entailed. They crossed the water curtain back into the outside world. Their stomachs were no longer painfully empty, and the world looked considerably clearer, the colors sharper and more vibrant, the sounds less menacing. Martha looked at the winding stream with new, deep respect. Frederick's map had generously given them a possible future, but the Guardian had unwittingly given them the critical time needed to find it undisturbed. Its involuntary but real loyalty to the dead pilot had effectively protected the secret not only from opportunistic scavengers, but specifically for them, a family desperately in need of it. When they again came into clear sight of the shattered fuselage, Martha's heart momentarily stopped. The boa constrictor was there again. They had faithfully returned. It was coiled in its usual accustomed spot on the left engine, its massive triangular head resting pleasantly on its muscular coils. But this time there was no paralyzing fear in Martha's gaze, only deep understanding and mutual respect. The beast slowly raised its head, testing the surrounding air with its forked tongue. It clearly smelled the familiar human presence, but also smelled the trace of the pilot's cave on their clothes. There were no threatening hisses, no aggressive attack posture, only silent, constant vigilance. Martha felt a strange, deep, almost spiritual connection. "Thank you," she whispered softly to the wind, knowing perfectly well that the snake couldn't understand human language, but feeling the deep need to say it aloud. "Thank you for faithfully guarding his secret for so long." The following days were of radical transformation. The abandoned plane completely ceased to be a terrifying tomb and gradually became a functional home. Paralyzing fear gave way to productive routine. With the renewed strength provided by Frederick's carefully distributed rations, Martha and James began to work systematically. Using the recovered tools, they meticulously cleared sections of the fuselage, creating defined spaces for sleeping, for cooking, for storage. The machete efficiently cut through invasive vegetation. The axe provided abundant firewood. The shovels dug channels to drain rainwater. Gradually, with infinite patience, they made multiple trips to the waterfall, transporting the remaining boxes with great effort. The seeds were carefully planted in a clearing they made near the stream, following the detailed instructions Frederick had meticulously written on the final pages of his journal. The mountainous land was fertile, virgin, eager to produce. The children, gradually regaining their strength with regular food, they began to help according to their abilities. Even the youngest collected stones to mark the boundaries of the emerging garden plot. The boa constrictor continued its silent vigil, observing the family with what Martha now interpreted as benevolent curiosity rather than a threat. Occasionally, they saw it slide to the stream to drink or hunt, but it always faithfully returned to the engine, to the sacred spot where Frederick had died. Martha began to occasionally leave it small offerings, fish they caught in the stream, small rodents they found. The snake accepted them without attacking, maintaining a kind of silent pact. Weeks passed, then full months. The seeds miraculously germinated, producing vibrant green shoots. The first ears of corn were a celebration that made Martha cry with pure joy. Beans climbed structures that James had proudly built. The fruit trees were still small, but promised future abundance. With the tools and their constant work, they gradually built an additional structure next to the fuselage, using wood from the jungle and metal recovered from the plain. They no longer lived inside the claustrophobic metal, but used it as a storage and protection during storms. The new shelter was more spacious, brighter, more human. Quinine saved the baby when she developed a high fever 3 months after their arrival. Martha administered the medicine exactly as the written instructions indicated, and the little one survived what otherwise would have been fatal. That moment solidified her eternal gratitude towards Frederick. James grew visibly, his body developing with proper nutrition, his confidence increasing with every responsibility he successfully undertook. He became a strong, capable young man, the man the family needed. The other children similarly flourished, their laughter finally filling the space that had once known only fearful silence. A full year after their desperate arrival, Martha stood in the clearing that was now their home, looking towards the distant valley where they had once been rejected. She felt no bitterness, only deep satisfaction. They had survived not only physically, but had built something true, something lasting. Frederick's legacy had flourished in their hard-working hands. The legend of the cursed plain persisted in the distant village, but now it included new rumors. Lights at night, voices of children playing, smoke from campfires. Some said the spirits had found peace. Others whispered about a ghost family. No one dared to investigate, deterred by the ancestral fear of the guardian. And so Martha and her children lived in a kind of isolated paradise, protected by the fear of others, sustained by the generosity of a benevolent dead man. Eventually, when James was 16, they began to make cautious contact with distant villages, trading their surplus harvest for additional tools and fabrics. They never revealed the exact location of their home or the secret of the plain. The guardian lived many more years, growing to a truly legendary size. When it finally died of old age, Martha mourned its loss as if it were a family member. They buried it ceremonially near the engine, next to the spot where they imagined Frederick rested. They placed stones marking both graves, that of the kind pilot who had given them a future, and that of the loyal creature who had protected their legacy. Martha's children grew up, married, and had their own children. The settlement gradually expanded, always respecting the jungle, always remembering the lessons of survival and gratitude. Martha lived to an old age, surrounded by 3 generations who existed solely because she had had the courage to choose known danger over certain death, because she had believed in the words of a dead stranger. In her last days, sitting under a fruit tree she had planted decades ago, Martha reflected on the strange chain of events that had saved them. A dying pilot showing kindness to a snake showing loyalty beyond death, a desperate widow choosing terror over resignation, and finally, a family building life where others only saw death. The shattered plane, that flying coffin that everyone feared, had become the seed of a thriving community. future generations would maintain it as a monument, a reminder that survival often comes from the most unexpected places, that kindness transcends even death, and that a mother's courage can transform a curse into a blessing. When Martha closed her eyes for the last time, it was with the deep satisfaction of knowing that she had fulfilled her purpose. Her children had not only survived, they had prospered, and Frederick's legacy would continue to live through them for generations to come. Thus ends this incredible story of survival, hope, and the transformative power of kindness. If this story has moved you as much as it has me in telling it, I wholeheartedly invite you to subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope can be found in the most unexpected places. I would love to know what impacted you most about this story. Was it Martha's bravery, the incredible loyalty of the guardian, or perhaps Frederick's generosity in thinking of unknown futures even in his last moments? Leave your reflections in the comments and let's create a community together where we share stories that inspire us to be better. Every comment you leave, every personal story you share, enriches everyone who is part of this family. See you in the next video with another story that will take your breath away. Until then, always remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it.